really do appreciate your efforts. There are 3 quick things I'd like to do before I start the presentation proper today. I want to acknowledge country. I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I want to tell you a little bit about what motivated this talk. So firstly, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I particularly want to acknowledge that the languages of these people, once spoken for 2,000 generations, lie sleeping. I'll be giving the talk today in English, which is something we don't often question. But I want to acknowledge that there are 250 other languages still spoken in Australia today. And many language speakers are the very last speakers of their language. Secondly, I'd like to introduce myself. There are some faces that aren't as familiar in the room. I'm Kathy Reid. I'm a doctoral researcher here at ANU. I promise I will finish my PhD this year. And in my PhD, I investigate speech technologies. Could someone close the door, please? With a focus on the data that goes into those models. And I ask questions like, who is represented in that data and who isn't? And how do we make speech technologies work better for the 8 billion voices that we have? Thirdly, I want to motivate or explain a little bit about what motivated this talk. And for those of you who know me well, while you might find it strange that I'm making some of the arguments that I make today, I have a strong open source background. I use Linux by choice, which tells you everything you need to know about my personality. And my belief in open source is anchored in this value that knowledge is power, and that knowledge shared is empowerment. That if we share our resources, share our code, our documentation, our research, together as a society, we all do better. It's an inherently collectivist belief, and it's one that has been deeply, deeply, fundamentally challenged by the changes wrought to the internet as AI companies troll it like an ocean and pollute it with AI-generated swill. That is to say, this talk is as personal as it is professional. So, today, I'm going to explore a phenomenon I'm calling the token wars. The token wars are a resource conflict, just like blood diamonds. And they're being fought now on a web server, through a parliamentary inquiry, and in a courtroom near you. The token wars aren't fought with violent weapons on physical battlefields. And I'm thinking today of people in both Iran and Israel. Rather, they're being pursued through technical, legal, and political means. But just like armed conflict, there are innocent casualties. This is not collateral damage, expected, anticipated, foreseeable harms. It's something that goes alongside resource conflict. Instead, what I'm calling these harms is alateral damage. It's not collateral, it's alateral. Unexpected, nonlinear, distal side effects, unintended consequences that you're already experiencing. And I'm going to unpack the token wars in 3 parts. The resources that are so in conflict are tokens. And in part 1 of this talk, I'll provide a basic technical grounding on tokens, transformers, and how together they're used to build large language models like ChatGPT and Llama and Claude and Falcon and Mistral. I'll stop there. In part 2, I'm going to use an economics lens to unpack why tokens are so valuable to AI companies. I'll look at how many tokens it takes to train an LLM and how tokens are becoming a scarce resource. I'll look at each of the actors in the token wars and explore what their intentions and actions are and what alateral damage these actions are causing. In part 3, I consider tokens and data as a form of capital and as a form of treasure, and for anyone from Aotearoa, Teonga. And I pose the question, how might we protect that treasure, both from those who want to take it for tokens, but more broadly safeguarding that token treasure from a cultural and social perspective? And we'll see this state of affairs is challenging the open web, a vision of the internet where knowledge is shared collaboratively, openly, to benefit everyone. And then I'm going to wrap up the talk by speculating on token futures, not those sorts of futures. And I'm going to think about what's going to happen next in the token wars. And I'll warmly welcome all of your questions. So to the talk proper. What's a token? Someone asked me only a few minutes ago. I'm so glad you asked. What an excellent question. So what is a token and why are they so powerful for machine learning and generative AI? A token is a building block, an atomic unit, and it's taken from a larger set of data called a corpus, so that analysis or computation can be performed on that corpus. And the process of creating tokens from datasets is called, surprisingly, tokenization. And it looks something like this. It's all right, Sonia, no drama. Here I've used character tokenization to turn the sentence into an array of characters. And this approach might be useful for identifying character frequency in a corpus, if you're trying to find the errant thorn in Old English. But as we'll see, it's often the relationships between tokens that are really important. And there aren't really any relationships between these tokens, these characters individually. But if I use word tokenization, we can start to create relationships between tokens. And the first step is to vectorize the tokens. It's okay, I'll explain what I'm doing here. In machine learning, vectorization is the process of taking non-numerical data, words, audio files, images, and turning it into numerical data so that it can be processed computationally. The long and the short of it is turning words into numbers. Vectorizing gives each token a numerical reference so that it becomes possible to compute or create relationships between tokens. And here I vectorize the sentence using a tokenizer, and you can see that it's added special tokens at the start and the end. We don't need to worry about them. It just tells the machine where the start and end is. Highlighted in blue, you'll see that two of the references are the same, the 1996 and the word the, and they've been given the same reference. So if I had more text, it would give the word the same numerical reference. So now that I've tokenized and vectorized this text, I want to create relationships between these tokens. And how might I approach that? In older natural language processing approaches, and I apologize because I'm totally oversimplifying here, relationships were created by looking at each token sequentially, one by one, to see if these two tokens together, bigrams, or three tokens together, trigrams, had special meaning together, like quick brown fox. These approaches were error-prone, time-consuming, and laborious, and they didn't work particularly well for representing meaning in text. But these early approaches were surpassed by transformers. not the machine thing. Different kind, thank you. Different kind of transformers, roll out. These were introduced in this very famous machine learning paper, Attention is All You Need, in 2017. And this has revolutionized machine learning and natural language processing. The key difference between how transformers work compared to how older methods of natural language processing work, where it looked at relationships sequentially, is that transformers weigh the relationships between tokens in a sequence all at once, all at the same time. And this enables the transformer to capture complex dependencies, so word endings, context, across the entire input sequence. And it's what allows the transformer to represent that the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, and that it wasn't the lazy dog that jumped over the quick brown fox. And it does this weighing of relationships through something called an attention mechanism. I was so glad you asked, what is an attention mechanism? The attention mechanism calculates how much each token focuses on or attends to every other token in a sequence. by computing similarity scores based on representations, so parts of words like word endings, ed, ing, and the position in which the token occurs in a sentence. And it creates a sum that determines how much each token's features contribute to the output of the model. So that's a lot of words. An analogy might be useful here. Say you walk into a cocktail party. I wouldn't because I'm a nerd and I don't socialize. But say you walk into a cocktail party and you scan the room for faces that are familiar. Hi. And the people you like the most. And you're more likely to speak with them, attend to them. There are folks there that you don't know, at least not yet, until you get some more training data, and you're less likely to speak with or attend to them. You guess, for example, that the person standing next to someone is their partner. That's positional encoding. And that the teenager behind them is their child, because the child has similar features to the parent. So similar feature representation. And now I'm going to give a demonstration. We can see the attention mechanism at work in this visualization. And what it's doing here is calculating how much each token focuses on every other token in the sequence all at once. So we totally all understand that, right? Joking. What I'm going to show you. Happy you've made a mistake on line 3. Actually, someone did tell me that. This is the big lie I hang with. So if I stop the animation, we can dig into some of these relationships. So for example, here, the transformer's creating relationships to the token quick. And we can see that it's created a strong relationship to Fox. It's attending to Fox with a weaker relationship to Brown, but it doesn't have a strong relationship with any other tokens. So quick, brown, fox is a very tightly related, closely coupled set of tokens. And here we can see the transformers creating relationships to the token jumped, and it's attending very closely to fox and to over. So it's attending. And so here what it's doing is creating the relationship that was the fox that jumped over the dog, not the dog that jumped over the fox. And here it's creating relationships to lazy. And lazy is attending to dog. So we know that it's the dog that's lazy, not the fox. So in just one sentence, using the attention mechanism, we've already seen the transformer build relationships with many tokens. So now that we have relationships, we can model the relationships. And these relationships are modeled by the language model using something called word embeddings. Word embeddings are basically how close is one word to another word in semantic space. King, queen, prince, princess, very close in semantic space. Purple, monkey, dishwasher, quite distant, unless it's been trained on that one Simpsons episode. I digress. Here we can see that brown, that cyan colour, which isn't showing up very well, is very closely associated with the semantic concept of colour. And fox, the yellow, is quite closely associated with the concept of colour as well. But dog is less closely associated because in our training data, we have training data that tells us that we have a brown fox, but we don't know what colour the lazy dog is. So we need some more training data. So that's LLMs 101, and they can go and create ChatGPT from scratch. What I want you to think about now is that I've just shown you the attention mechanism at work and the weights and the word embeddings from one sentence. But what happens with tokens and attention weights and embeddings at scale? Imagine now that a transformer is applied to a much larger body of text, billions of tokens, all of Reddit, or Stack Overflow, or I don't know, all of the public internet. we can start to see the power that transformers have and inferring relationships, embeddings, between tokens. And we can see how the data, the tokens that are used to train transformer models, encode the patterns, the frequencies, the biases of the data that they're trained on. And it's those relationships that are used when we ask ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini to generate text as an output using a prompt as input. The way most large language models work is that given an input prompt, they'll generate an output, usually a sentence or paragraph of text. But how do they determine what to output? Content warning, mathematical equations. At their heart, at their heart, LLMs are essentially next token predictors. Given the relationships that were created between tokens during training, all those millions and millions of calculations of similarity and position, the LLM can query those relationships and predict, using probabilities, what the next token might be. In simple terms, what this is saying is calculate the next token in a sequence, given what I know about the relationships between words that are represented in my word embeddings and that may have had some manual adjustments. And I'm going to try this with you all now because some might argue you're all human implementations of a large language model. So you're going to try this with me? No,
I'll be your token.
Thank you. You're right to be scared. It's fine. So if I gave you the input prompt a long time ago, you might predict the next tokens as
Galaxy.
very well done. Now this one might be for the older sci-fi crew. The sky was the color of television.
Static channel.
Very, very close. Tuned to a dead channel. Oh, people been renewed. You've made my day, Bill. Thank you. I've got one more for the dystopian socialists. Hi.
Hi.
A bright cold day in April. I'll give you a hint. Orwell. Clocks.
It's 1984. I don't know what follows. I've read the book. But
A bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. So it's the very first opening line of 1984, George Orwell. Because you're not going to get a presentation from me without some form of dystopia. So my point is that large language models predict what they're trained on. So I see no one here was deeply trained on George Orwell, but we have a lot of people who are very correctly Star Wars fans. So we've had a glimpse of how powerful transformers can be at using those embeddings to generate content. And we can start to see why tokens, the raw material for transformers, are so important. But you say, Kathy, you haven't fully answered the questions of why tokens are so incredibly valuable. That's true. So in this section, I'm going to explore token economics and show why tokens are so valuable. I'm going to take a look at the actors in the token wars, their intentions, their actions, and explore some of the alateral damage that's happening, the unintended consequences of this resource conflict. I'm getting really hot up here. Is everyone else really hot as well?
sure, open the door.
Let's open the door again. Sorry, I don't need to like steam you all.
No worries, I'm your token.
Thanks, Paul. So to explain why tokens are so valuable, I'm going to draw on Elinor Ostrom's work on governing the commons. So I'm switching here from machine learning as a discipline to economics as a discipline, and because I'm in cybernetics, I can do that. So Elinor Ostrom distinguishes resources through two characteristics: excludability, whether the use of the resource can effectively be denied to other people, and rivalry, whether my use of a resource depletes the resource for everybody else. And by combining these two characteristics, we arrive at 4 different types of resource. I promise this will be important to the talk. Personal property is both excludable and rivalrous. That's my chocolate bar. It's not available to you. You're excluded from it. And if I eat it, which I most assuredly will, it's depleted. You can't have it. Common pool resources are available to everyone, but if they're used, they're depleted, like fresh water or fisheries. Club or toll resources are only available to members or subscribers, but one person's use of them doesn't affect it for everybody else. If I binge watch Netflix and you binge watch Netflix, we're not interfering with each other's binge watching of Netflix. I might have opinions on what you're watching, but we're not going to interfere with each other. Public goods are available to everyone, and if people use them, they're generally not depleted, like open source software, fresh air, beaches. And at first glance, we might think that tokens, because they're digital, are public goods. They're available to everyone. They're just sitting around on a website ready to be harvested. And because they're digital, they can be copied. If I scrape a bunch of tokens, I'm not excluding them from use by others. But this is wrong. And now I'm going to prove why. So here I argue that tokens need to be thought of as rivalrous, meaning that they're either common pool resources available to everyone but depletable, or personal property, only available to the actor who owns them. But why, I hear you ask, why, Kathy, are tokens rivalrous? Why does my use of a token deplete it and make it less usable for others? And now I'm going to answer that question. So firstly, in general, the more tokens a model is trained on, the better the model performs. It's more accurate and it's more generalizable, which means it's able to be applied across a wider range of tasks. And in the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion in the number of tokens used to train models. This graph uses published data where it's available, but some of the later models like Gemma and Claude are estimates because they're not published. But you can clearly see the trend. Tiny little bits of tokens, a few more tokens. Oh my gosh, all the tokens in the world. LLMs of 2024 were trained on orders of magnitude. By my rough calculation, 4 orders of magnitude more tokens than LLMs of just 5 years ago. Magnitude. In fact, pause for effect, we're getting to the point where models are now trained on nearly all of the publicly available data in the whole world. This work by researcher Mark Cummins at the University of Oxford estimates that the total number of tokens in the public web is about 60 to 160 trillion. And most estimates for the number of tokens used to train Claude 3 Opus, because that number isn't released by Anthropic, are at about 40 trillion tokens. So if those estimates are correct, and my read of them is they're reasonable, Claude 3 Opus is trained on about 2/3 of the public data in the entire world. This phenomenon, the fact that models are beginning to exhaust all available tokens in the world, is being labelled the token crisis, with key machine learning engineers like Ilya Sutskever here starting to call data the fossil fuel of AI because it's getting harder to find and more expensive to refine, just like petrocarbons. So models now require more and more data to train on to be considered state of the art. But that still doesn't explain why tokens are rivalrous. Why, if one actor has them, it depletes them for others. Surely if I scrape the whole entire World Wide Web for tokens and you scrape the whole entire World Web for tokens, we can both use those tokens? No. And I'll explain why. You can see a pattern here. So the key purpose of large language models is to generate text. That might be for a cover letter, to apply for a job if you're like about to submit your PhD, or it might be to create copy for a website, or to generate clickbaity marketing posts for social media. When an AI model produces data, we call the resulting data synthetic data to distinguish it from human-produced data. Some of this data is high quality. A very small amount is high quality. And it's very useful in natural language processing where there's scarce real data due to privacy regulations, health, medicine, medical records. But some synthetic data, Reid most, is very poor quality. And I prefer to refer to it as AI slop. And if we imagine all of the models out there, GPT, Claude, Gemma, Falcon, Mistral, and so on, being used to generate synthetic data, AI slop, at scale, we can see how the internet is filling up with this synthetic content. We've all done Google searches recently where we can't find what we're looking for because all the top results are stuffed with SEO optimized AI slop. There are whole websites now just filled with AI slop as far as the eye can see, just geared to getting to #1 on Google. So this is one example of alateral damage in the token wars. The unintended consequence that the internet is now so full of AI slop that it's getting harder and harder to find the content you're actually looking for. This wasn't intended and it wasn't exactly foreseen, but it's now a consequence that we, regular internet users, are now dealing with. And in fact, we even have the term slop squatting to refer to actors creating malware, computer viruses, with the same name as libraries that are frequently hallucinated in AI coding assistants like Codex and Cursor. So there's a new word for you today, slop squatting. So if you're an organization that's scraping the web to gather tokens, the proliferation of AI slop is deeply problematic. Although there are models which try and distinguish between human-created content and synthetically generated content, they're not super accurate and they're plagued with problems. For example, they tend to flag content written by people who speak English as a second or third or fourth or fifth language as AI generated, when it's not. So it's hard to detect synthetic data. And the problem this can cause with LLMs is something called model collapse. And model collapse is where a model reduces or constrains its outputs, narrows the diversity of what it can generate. Requisite variety. A good analogy here is if you've ever taken a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, it loses something with each iteration. That's model collapse. And model collapse is caused by training a model on synthetic data, AI slop. AI slop is like a photocopy of the original. And so if a model is trained or fine-tuned on synthetic data, there's a narrowing, a constriction on what that model can produce. This is a simplified diagram of how it works. Models trained on human-created data have more diversity, more variety in their outputs. Collapse models are grey and beige and boring because AI slop is grey and beige and boring. M dash. And so now we see the reason why tokens created from human-generated data are rivalrous. The internet is polluted with AI slop, synthetic data, just like a depleted fishery or waterway that's been mismanaged. So that's a little bit about why tokens are so valuable. The token crisis means we're reaching hard limits on how much data is available to train on. The prevalence of synthetic data, AI slop, means that good tokens, human-generated, diverse, authentic, real, are hard to find. And we've seen the alateral damage that's harmed our ability to search the internet along the way. Sorry for the depression session. And because tokens are so valuable and they're rivalrous, it's understandable that they're heavily contested. So, who are the adversaries in the token wars? What are their intentions? I'm going to have to sit down. And what alateral damages, unintended consequences, are they causing? Can't you just read my mind and go to the right slide? Actually, it's pretty scary. I'm not sure I want to do that. So content creators, individuals such as authors, artists, videographers, are key actors in the token wars because it's often their work publicly available on the web that's scraped and harvested for tokens without consent or remuneration and often in violation of copyright. And we've seen lots of examples of this. And one key concern for this group of actors is how to prevent their content, their original works, from being scraped and harvested for tokens. The other concern they have is that now their works have been harvested, how might they seek redress and compensation retrospectively? And one of the ways content creators are addressing these concerns is by suing the companies who make machine learning models, with the key arguments resting on copyright law. As individuals, it's often hard for creators to have their voice heard. And what we're seeing is that representative groups such as guilds and publishers are bringing legal action. What's really interesting here and unexpected happening is that groups of individual creators have banded together to bring legal action. So we're seeing the emergence of these ad hoc collectives rather than traditional representative groups, which I find really, I think there's something really interesting in that. And this is a data visualization from Wired, basically showing who's suing who at the moment. And I've highlighted the groups of individuals, the collectives in orange. So this isn't just like one or two, there's a real trend here. So a group of actors with perhaps more power in this resource conflict are platforms containing user-generated content. So think Reddit or Stack Overflow if you're a developer. And their position has generally been one of seeking to get a commercial benefit from AI companies who are harvesting their content for tokens, generally without consultation with or without any benefits flowing to the users who create the content on those platforms. And Reddit is one well-known case here. And they entered into a content partnership with OpenAI, where OpenAI pays Reddit for the content that other people create on Reddit. And then OpenAI uses it to train ChatGPT. However, the content creators on Reddit don't see any of this value at all. And many of them sabotage their posts in protest. Very similar thing happened with Stack Overflow. So Stack Overflow is where developers basically write up problems that they're having. Other people come and answer those problems. Very much like a mutual exchange of information. So Stack Overflow also sold its user-generated content to OpenAI. And again, there was user backlash and many users deleted their posts in protest. So it's another form of alateral damage because the public good that this website was doing is now either compromised or no longer being built on. And I want to pause here and let you know that for openness and transparency, I want to be clear about my positionality. When this happened, I deleted both my Reddit and Stack Overflow accounts. And I had quite a lot in my Stack Overflow account. And when we think of actors in the token wars, we don't necessarily think of archival institutions as a key actor. So libraries, archives, museums, galleries, the GLAM sector. But these institutions are caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, they often hold vast amounts of material, ripe for tokenizing, and they're often chronically underfunded. And a bucket of cash from an AI company will be very, very attractive. So how are they navigating this tension? One institution I want to point to here is the National Film and Sound Archive, who recently released their principles for machine learning and artificial intelligence creation and use. And at the heart of these is maintaining trust, which means seeking consent from stakeholders and copyright owners about how the materials they've entrusted to the care of the institution are used for machine learning. And this is essentially the exact opposite of what Stack Overflow and Reddit did. They've destroyed their stakeholder trust. Now I'm going to turn to private companies, and they tend to hold a lot of material, well, privately. And their consideration is how to leverage that private information, often fragmented, different formats, disparate, so that it can be harnessed for AI. And AI companies, not to be deterred, have begun to find ways to address this challenge and access this private data. And we saw in November that Anthropic have released something called the Model Context Protocol. It's an open protocol, so anyone can use this protocol to basically design connectors into private data that you can then hook into large language models like Anthropic's Claude or OpenAI's GPT. And this is billed as a way to, and I'm directly going to quote, so I'm going to change to my direct quote voice, connect AI systems with data sources, replacing fragmented integrations with a single protocol to give AI systems access to the data they need. Note the wording and the framing. It's the AI system that needs that clean, streamlined, well-formatted data, not the AI company that sells the AI system or the company who owns the data. And this is another form of alateral damage. The narrative around AI is changing to one of techno-determinism, one of inevitability. The AI system needs the data, so you need our product to feed the AI system the data it needs as cleanly and as efficiently as possible, rather than questioning why the AI system needs more data or what problem the AI system is solving in the first place. Because if you don't connect your data, the narrative goes, your company will be left behind. So the AI companies are creating this narrative, this sense of urgency to connect private data stores through the Model Context Protocol. It doesn't get better, I'm sorry. Of course, one of the key actors in the token wars are the AI model companies themselves. And their key goal, from what I'm able to determine, is to harvest as many good human-created tokens as possible from wherever they can get them under whatever licensing arrangement they can get away with to train their models. And in general, they've used fair use provisions in US copyright law to claim that their actions here are valid and legal. However, many jurisdictions like Australia don't have fair use provision in copyright law, so scraping websites for tokens is likely to be in breach of law in Australia. I'm not a lawyer, don't take that for gospel. One of the other tactics we started to see from AI companies is the co-option of institutions to get access to institutional data. For example, the Institutional Data Initiative is a partnership between Harvard and Microsoft to create a large public commons of data. So thinking in Eleanor Ostrom's terms, public commons, creating a public good. On one hand, this is positive because Microsoft is paying, contributing financially to this public commons, but it's also setting a precedent that might pressure other institutions to follow suit. Like, imagine, for example, a large national university that might be $250 million in debt. And if you thought, but wait, Kathy, aren't there already large public data sets of the World Wide Web that have been created for training AI? You'd be absolutely right. The most well-known of these is the Common Crawl dataset, which is a huge dataset of text scraped from the web made available for AI training with a research initiative. But one of the reactions we've seen to the large-scale scraping of data, more alateral damage, is that many of the websites in Common Crawl, like news publishing websites, have blocked Common Crawl. And their intent is to sell their token data to AI companies at a price, because exclusivity yields a higher price. If it's not in Common Crawl, it's worth more to OpenAI. And in turn, that action has adverse impacts for researchers who either now have to pay for the data that used to be in Common Crawl or find other data sets to use for their research. So it's a second order consequence, a knock-on form of alateral damage. So, what do regulators make of this situation? In Australia, there's increasing recognition that the developers of AI products need to be transparent around their use of copyrighted data when training models, so as identified in the recent Senate Select Committee report. And we do have voluntary guardrails which address managing data quality and provenance, but as yet we don't have any regulations. other than copyright law to govern the use of data harvesting for tokens. So, in my view, our regulations to prevent harvesting of tokens are very, very weak. In other countries, we're already seeing regulators begin to tackle how to balance the competing interests of rights holders to be remunerated for content that's used for tokens with the demand for more investment and innovation with AI. They seem to be erring on the side of, and I'm directly quoting here, mainlining AI. So mainlining has two different semantic meanings. In a computing context, it can mean to bring code that you've been working on into a main branch or into the main body of code. But it also has another meaning related to illicit drug use, where you inject drugs directly into your veins. The meaning here remains ambiguous. In summary, there are several actors who have tokens that AI companies want. And AI companies have a range of tactics to get these tokens. And in the middle are regulators trying to balance the interests of both sides. Who would have thought that the humble token, a piece of data chopped up and turned into numbers, would be at the heart of such technical, legal, and regulatory conflicts? And you see now what I've done in parts 1 and 2 of this talk. I've zoomed out from tokens as a technology to the tokenomics that are reshaping our world, the socio-technical systems in which tokens are imbricated. So in part 3 of the talk, I get really practical and I turn attention, it's all you need, to tokens and data as a form of capital. And this is one of my favorite academic papers of all time. I'm almost finished my PhD. I'm allowed to have favorite academic papers. It's by Jathan Sadowski, who's at Monash, and he'll be at Oz STS. He's going to be at Oz STS. Not quite Jeff Barker, but he's well on his way. And he casts data as a form of capital that's driving investment decisions, political decisions, and technical decisions. And given the earlier sections of my talk where I outline why tokens are valuable and increasingly rare, we can see that we might want to protect our data assets, our token treasure, our taonga. And how do we usually protect our assets? We might store them securely, lock them up, prevent them from being stolen. And that's one option we have with data. We can put it behind a logging wall or a paywall. And that's what a lot of companies have done. And if we think back to Elinor Ostrom's 4 types of resources, they're privatizing their data assets. They're privatizing the assets. They're no longer shared. But what if the value of your assets depends on them being in the open? And for many artists and authors and creators, the value of their work, the value of their creations resides on them being in public display. It's like people selling things on Instagram, or I'm a knitter, so I spend far too many hours browsing knitting websites looking for like that perfect color and shade of yarn. And one tactic that's increasingly used for visual data, imagery, and for audio data, speech, is that of data poisoning. Data poisoning is where the training data, tokens, are used for training a model, are altered in such a way, and the technical term for this is perturbed, so that they alter the model during the training, essentially tricking it into providing a poisoned or an altered output. And 2 emerging tools here are Nightshade for data poisoning images and Anti-Fake for data poisoning speech. I've actually used Anti-Fake a little bit. For text content, like text on websites, we're seeing the emergence of a new type of tool called a tar pit. Nepenthes, which is named after a plant that traps its predators, just beautiful naming, just whoever built this, I want to buy them coffee. So Nepenthes is a tar pit tool And the way it works is that it generates endless URLs for the scrapers to follow, sending them down never-ending pathways, generating page after page of Markov babble, which is algorithmically generated nonsense. So think the Herald Sun. The downside with Nepenthes is that if you use it, your website probably won't get indexed by search engines because they're too busy going down all the pathways. So this means we have to rely on other methods if we both want to be found on the web and protect our token treasure. One method that's become quite widely adopted here is a CDN, a content delivery network. And one of the most popular here is Cloudflare. I don't receive any kickbacks from Cloudflare. It's just an example. And essentially, you place your website or app behind Cloudflare, and the scrapers have to get through Cloudflare to get to your website to scrape it. It's like a really high fence that they have to get through. There is a free tier, but if you have a large website, you're going to find yourself paying a lot of money to have Cloudflare as a service. Other tools rely on robots text, and robots text is a standard used by web servers, and search engines. And it's a way for web servers to tell search engines and crawlers what should and should not be indexed. And in this example, the robots.txt is saying for all user agents, so all scrapers, all browsers, everyone who visits this website, you should not index WP admin and WP includes, which are like system files of a WordPress content management system. And in this example, it's saying GPT bot, you're not allowed to index anything. That should work, right? No. So the downside of robots.txt is that respecting the robots.txt directives is entirely voluntary, a little bit like the voluntary guardrails from the regulators. And because tokens are so valuable, robots.txt is often ignored. And here's some evidence of that from my own website from a tool I use called Dark Visitors. We can see here that Applebot first requests the robots.txt file, which blocks it, and then it ignores robots.txt and tries to get content from my website anyway. So there's two forms of alateral damage here: unexpected, unintended distal side effects. The first is that as someone who hosts content on the web, I now have to care about yet another thing and put in place solutions like Cloudflare or Dark Visitors to prevent content from being harvested. Demand for tokens has caused more work for me and other recreational system administrators. The second is more insidious, and it's illustrated by this graph. The volume of traffic now served to non-human agents, scrapers, bots, token harvesters, now represents nearly half of most web service total traffic. And I got the 2025 edition of this report last week. It's now more than half. This means that we're using more power, more energy, more water to serve content to non-human actors. That is, both actions, blocking the scrapers or serving the scrapers, requires more infrastructure, more power, more energy, and more human effort. Sorry, I didn't realize this talk was going to be so depressing. There's one more piece I want to cover before I wrap up the talk today, and that's the concept of data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is about who controls, who manages, and who benefits from the data that is collected. And here I want to call out the relationship between AI models and cultural data, cultural language, cultural knowledge, cultural histories. And this is one of the focuses of the Indigenous data sovereignty movement. And I want to ask the question, what right do AI companies have to cultural data, to cultural knowledge and cultural histories that are encoded through tokens? So if I think about Facebook's No Language Left Behind model, which looks at about 400 different languages, how is that representing language? How is that revitalizing language? So I think there's some really big questions here. Who benefits when those tokens are transformed into large language models? The answers here aren't necessarily clear. Encoding cultural language and data might help to preserve culture and language, but who owns those models? Who controls them? And who profits from them? Tokens are treasure, and they're worth protecting. And it's another reason that we need to rethink what we place on the open web. So in closing, I'm going to speculate a little around what our token futures might look like. In the short term, we're going to see a hunt for more tokens. Every app we use, every device we have, every interaction will be harvested for tokens due to the token crisis and how inferior synthetic data, AI slop, is. And in reaction, I think that will spur more development of tools and techniques to help protect our token treasure. We won't be limited to just a CDN solution or to a plugin which enforces robots text. I think we'll see data poisoning methods emerge for text-based content. So imagine an Apenthes plugin for WordPress. And it's going to get integrated with content management systems like Drupal or like Jekyll that we use here at the school. So the school content is being harvested and scraped every single day. And it's going to be harder for companies to harvest tokens, just like petrochemicals, which will make them even rarer and more valuable and more contested. And I hear you thinking, gee, that's a cybernetic reinforcement loop. You're absolutely right. And I think we collectively, as a society, will begin to better understand the dynamic interactions wrought by tokens, the alateral damage and the distal effects, the unintended consequence of this resource conflict. And we're going to have a more nuanced understanding that we're right bang smack in the middle of the token wars. Thank you very much.